I published my weekly post earlier today where I discuss my stock, bond, and treasury bill purchases over the week ending last Friday, January 31st, 2025. I also discuss in that post some of the more troubling developments over the past week in the United States from my perspective. The executive branch of the government has basically taken over in material respects Congress's constitutional power of the purse as provided in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 9 of the Constitution and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. In this video, I will be discussing some of the issues that are impacting my investment decisions at the current time. It is important to be non-political when making decisions about your investments, and I certainly try to do that. The starting point in investment allocations is to make an informed judgment on how much money is necessary and will be necessary to meet financial goals. Since that judgment will largely govern the amount of risk that will have to be taken to reach those goals, which includes the expenses incurred during retirement uh, and everything that occurs prior to then, whether it's buying your first home, paying for college tuition, future living expenses, and fund funds for desired travel and entertainment expenses. Most people do not have that many years when they can earn and save enough money after paying expenses to build a nest egg sufficient to meet their their goals, and including particularly their goal uh, during retirement. My investment objective now is for my total investment accounts to generate at least 4% in income, which will allow me to invest after taxes and expenses anywhere from 30 to 50% of that income. So that defines for me a very low risk portfolio at my age and given that financial condition, which is what I have now. Investing in what I own will not be sufficient to meet the financial goals of most persons. My stock allocation is only at around 10% of my total portfolio, and even that is spread out over maybe 250 different stocks. With treasury bills and notes, short-term investment-grade corporate bonds, high-quality Tennessee municipal bonds, and treasury money market funds making up most of the remainder in that allocation. That is not going to cut it for anyone seeking to grow capital or having to grow capital over many years at a much faster rate, adjusted for expected inflation, which will be an issue and an unknowable one for certain, at least, as to the extent. I use a 2.5% to 3% average annual inflation rate as my best guess when planning for the future. I could end up, it could end up being much worse and has been much worse during periods of my lifetime, including the period when I started to invest, which was starting in the late 1960s through the 1970s and early 1980s. What troubles me now about the stock market is that valuations are stretched, in my opinion, and I'm more of a traditionalist when it comes to valuing stocks. And there are, without question, many potential risks that are readily apparent that could, if they occur, send the stock market lower. I believe that a valuation reset is necessary. Something like a 30% decline in the S&P 500 from the current level around 6,000 in order to make me more comfortable about assuming more stock risk. I am not comfortable now. Risks are easy to identify and need to be monitored. I listed several near the end of a recent YouTube video that I will link in the more section below. I'm just going to talk about one of them now, and that is tariffs, a tariff war. A current risk is just how far will Trump go in implementing his tariff increases. I don't think he fully appreciates the damage that can occur from a tariff war to the U.S. economy. All countries will retaliate to every tariff increase imposed by the U.S. On their exports. While the 25% tariffs on exports from Canada and Mexico have been delayed for 30 days, and no one should be surprised if they go into effect in early March, the 10% tariff on China's exports did go into effect, and China has already retaliated with tariffs on U.S. exports, with a 15% tariff on U.S. coal and liquefied natural gas and 10% on U.S. crude oil, agricultural machinery, pickup trucks, and large engine cars. Potentially more important, in my opinion, China has placed export controls on 25 rare minerals that are essential for and several U.S. manufacturing processes, particularly in the tech sector, and has increased regulatory scrutiny over two major U.S. Corporations, Google and Apple, and have placed two more companies, PVH and Illumina, on its unreliable entities list, which will hurt their sales in China. More of this kind of retaliatory action can be expected if the tariff war with China becomes more problematic than it is now. Colombia, as you may remember, complained to the U.S. about how their citizens were being treated during the deportation process, and Trump responded by slapping a 25% tariff on all Colombia exports to the U.S. Colombia had to avoid upsetting Trump in any way, since that it's a small country and those exports are important to it. So it backed down on the deportation issue, but then canceled today a joint venture between their state-owned energy company and an American energy company, Occidental, allegedly based on environmental concerns. I'm expecting countries to retaliate against what they perceive as undesirable from their perspective bullying tactics from Trump. Trump's statements about the U.S. taking over Gaza, removing the residents who call that area home, and building some kind of modern Riviera, while certainly unlikely to happen, created unnecessarily, and he will be doing this constantly over the next 4 years, more ill will, in this case in the Arab world, that could have far-reaching negative implications. Today, the main beneficiary of the wild and crazy Trump plan was a rise in gold prices and a flight to safety in U.S. Treasuries. Falling interest rates, which resulted in my bond-heavy portfolio gaining in value today, and a private payroll report from ADP that was positive, reignited a stock rally, at least for today. The 10-year Treasury yield declined 9 basis points to close at 4.43% using the Treasury Department data for February 5th, 2025. You can find that data simply by Googling, quote, Treasury yield curve, end quote. The first entry is, quote, interest rate statistics, Department of Treasury, end quote. Then click daily Treasury yield, par yield curve, end quote. Below that link is the real yield curve data for the tips 5, 10, 20 and 30-year tips. You can compute the break-even inflation rate simply by subtracting the real yield from the nominal yield. The 30-year nominal treasury closed today at 4.64%, and the real yield of the 30-year tip was at 2.39%, creating a 2.25% break-even inflation rate, which is the average annual CPI over the next 30 years for the buyer of the tip, starting out with a much lower coupon to break even with the buyer of the non-inflation protected treasury that has a much higher coupon. The break-even inflation rate is the market's best guess at the moment for annual CPI over whatever time is relevant to you. If 10 years is a relevant time, you can compute the break-even inflation rate for that period, or 20 years. Mine is sort of in between 10 and 20. The average annual inflation rate in the U.S. starting in 1914 was 3.35%, 3.3% over the over the period ending, I should say, in 2024. So I'm assuming a rate when I make my best guess for inflation somewhere in between the break-even inflation rate and the average long-term rate. I'm not hopeful that inflation will remain that tame, meaning 2.25% average annual CPI over the next 30 years. But then I'm not looking at 30 years at all for myself. You may need to look at that data.